It's been called the conveyor belt of death. The U.S. wants to hold several prisoner executions back to back, but will a lack of lethal drugs block the attempt? Also on today's program, Lula da Silva's plan for staying out of jail. I spoke to the lawyer of Brazil's former president, who tells me Lula could return to the campaign trail. I'm Imran Garda, and this is the Newsmakers. Death penalty opponents say it's a pace and scale they've never seen before. The U.S. state of Arkansas wants to put these inmates to death in a span of 11 days. Critics say it amounts to a mass execution. But what lies behind the authorities' rush to the death chamber? Is it a push for justice, or the fact that their stock of lethal drugs expires at the end of the month? Once the chemicals are gone, they'll be hard to replace. Many manufacturers are refusing to sell to death penalty states, and the boycotts have hindered executions in places such as Nevada, where an expensive death chamber was built but can't be used. Today's newsmakers are these death row inmates, as we ask if the United States is committing a crime of its own.
It's been a 25-year nightmare for the victims that have had to deal with this, and now it's time for that justice to be carried out.
It's the most aggressive schedule of executions ever attempted in the U.S. since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976.
Nobody in the modern history of the death penalty in the United States has ever attempted to carry out 8 executions in the space of 11 days. Nobody in the modern history of the United States death penalty has attempted to carry out 2 sets of back-to-back executions within the same week, let alone 4 sets within the space of 11 days.
But there have been a few hitches to the plan. 4 of the 8, Don Davis, Bruce Ward, Stacey Johnson, and Jason McGehee, have been given stays of execution by various court orders. Liddell Lee, who was convicted of murdering a woman more than 20 years ago, was the first to be executed last week, Arkansas's first execution since 2005. Jack Jones and Marcel Williams, both convicted of rape and murder in the 1990s, were put to death earlier this week. Kenneth Williams' execution is scheduled for Thursday night.
When do we want it?
Critics have rallied against the executions, citing an increased risk of error in carrying out the lethal injections, which could result in cruel and unusual punishment. The execution involves a 3-drug cocktail. Midazolam is a sedative in short supply, set to expire at the end of the month. It's meant to render the subject unconscious and prevent pain that would be caused by the 2 other drugs. But death penalty critics say it's not strong enough to counteract the effects of vercuronium bromide, which stops the inmate's breathing, and potassium chloride, which stops the heart. A growing number of pharmaceutical manufacturers, both inside the US and in Europe, have refused to sell their products to be used in lethal injections. Pfizer was the last company to do so. Such moves have made it harder for states to get the drugs they need for lethal injection, a method which accounts for the vast majority of executions in the US. Supporters in the more than 30 US states that have the death penalty have cited deterrence of potential killers, as well as justice for victims' families, as the reasons why it should be used. And while polls have shown a recent drop in public support for capital punishment, it may be that the practical aspects will prove a hindrance to state-sanctioned killing in the United States. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, let's talk to Deborah Deno, law professor at Fordham University in New York, and from Philadelphia, John Lott. He's the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Thanks both of you for joining us. John Lott, do you support these Arkansas executions?
I think having the death penalty both saves lives in terms of deterring crime and also saves money. I think the fact that you have the death penalty on the table allows plea bargains for many expensive first-degree murder cases that otherwise would have to go to court. And I think, the bottom line, though, is that by deterring criminals, I mean, just look at what just happened in South Carolina with the Charleston church shooter. The fact that he was willing to go and accept a first-degree life sentence pleas as long as the prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. I think that's just a perfect example of how criminals how killers want to avoid the death penalty. It shows deterrence.
Okay, Deborah Deno, despite the race against the drug expiration clock and the rush to execute these men, John Lott supports the killing of these men. Do you?
Well, actually, Mr. Lott never answered your question. Your question pertained to the Arkansas killings. He started just talking about the death penalty generally. First of all, he was wrong because the death penalty, everybody knows it's far, far more expensive to have a death penalty than to lock prisoners up for life. That's number one. Number two, it's not a deterrent. That's been shown over and over. Number three, the Arkansas executions illustrate the country's problematic use of the death penalty, given that the drug manufacturer is now suing the state for using its particular drug. So let's stick and look at the Arkansas case, which Mr. Lott is not doing.
Mm-hmm. Deborah, there are convicted rapists and murderers among these men. Do you question whether the death penalty is actually the proper punishment for them, or the way in which the death penalty is being carried out here? Are you principally against the death penalty?
I'm not principally against the death penalty. I think if the death penalty were administered fairly, I wouldn't have anything, a problem with it. The problem is it's not administered fairly. The execution process is a complete debacle. It's extremely expensive. The state of California has already spent over $1 billion on the death penalty itself, and it hasn't even executed anybody in 11 years. So I think it's a disaster. It's been widely recognized as such, and it's an economic disaster.
Mm-hmm. So, John, in a fair system, sure, go for the death penalty, but the system's not fair. That's why Deborah's against it. Doesn't that sound reasonable?
I mean, just take the last point about the cost. I mean, if you just look at the appeals process for the death penalty, it is very costly. But what she's ignoring is all the first-degree murder cases that don't go to trial because they accept a plea bargain. First-degree murder cases are very expensive. And if you have somebody who has special circumstances, so it's not just doing the types of crimes that you mentioned, but they have to do something else also, like kill multiple people or engage in some other type of heinous felony that's there. If I can go and say to them, okay, I can't give you second-degree murder, I'm stuck with first-degree, but I'll take the death penalty off the table. You have all these plea bargains, and those are very expensive cases, and she's not including those. And as far as deterrence goes, you know, you look at the academic studies, the vast majority of peer-reviewed academic studies find that the death penalty deters crime. And you just have to see how frequently these killers take a plea bargain in order to avoid the death penalty as evidence of the deterrence effect there.
Okay, so Deborah, let's get Deborah.
Any prosecutor.
Okay, Deborah, you know, plea bargains, you have these guys confessing and taking plea bargains. Isn't that a benefit?
I don't accept Mr. Lott's argument about the plea bargains. First of all, he's offered no statistics whatsoever, no study to show that that's the case. That's number one. I'm not aware of any study that shows that there's a cost savings because of plea bargains. Number two, we already know time and again, there have been multiple studies throughout the country how expensive the death penalty is, and that's including everything that Mr. Lott is talking about. A death penalty case is more expensive. And number three, this is about justice. Mr. Lott only focuses on the economics of this issue. This is supposed to be about fairness. It's ridiculous that the state of Arkansas is speeding up executions merely because a drug is expiring.
Mm-hmm. John, 152 death row inmates have been found innocent since 1973. Are they, what, collateral damage?
Well, I don't know of one single case where somebody who is innocent's been executed. You know, if you want to, these people are equivalent to being on, you know, on life imprisonment in a sense. But look, when you say 152, look, there've been like 200 people who various violent crimes generally, because of DNA evidence, have been found not guilty, but or innocent. But the problem that you face is that you're talking about over 40 years.
No, but,
you're talking about tens of millions of violent crimes
it's
during that period of time.
Hold on just for a second. I mean, if we just stick to that number, 152 people have basically lost their lives. Many of them were on death row for decades, right? And they were exonerated by DNA and so on. Doesn't that tell you that while you don't have to be principally against the death penalty to say, hey, maybe the system gets it wrong, so perhaps we need to be cautious about this?
You have to go and take into account the number of murder convictions that you have generally, and violent crimes generally. I mean, for all DNA cases, you're talking about a little bit over 200 cases, and that's for all types of violent crimes, rapes and robberies and other types of things. The rates of mistakes that occur is very low, but more generally, you have to deal with the fact that there's not one of these guys. Even if you didn't have the death penalty, they would have been in jail anyway. They would have been there for life imprisonment. And not one of these cases were these people executed.
Deborah?
Not one case can you point to where an innocent person was executed.
Deborah?
Mr. Lott's not familiar with the literature in this area. There have been numerous cases where it was clear that somebody was executed and that they were innocent. That's number one. And there's been a substantial proportion of these cases. We know that. That's been written. I mean, these have been published articles and statistics on this very issue. For Mr. Lott to say that no one has been executed that we know of as being innocent is simply inaccurate. That's number one. Number two, there have numerous people have been released from prison. They have been on death row wrongly. And it's been shown that they didn't commit the crime at all, and that they were on death row for decades, and then released and found to be totally innocent.
Deborah,
so
they would have been in first-degree murder cases. They would have been in jail for their life in any case.
Okay,
the question is
that's a fair point from you, John.
That are
okay,
there.
fair point from you, John. Deborah, let me ask you. I know you're against. Sorry to interrupt you.
And totally inaccurate.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you. Let me ask you, Deborah, you're against the rush to execution in Arkansas. And of course, you know, for many people, the fact that the drug is running out and they're sort of rushing to execute these men, it's very icky for them. Despite that, and despite the fact that some people have gone through torture, if you like, through botched executions, 88% of the 1,449 executed people in the United States were executed by lethal injection. This is again since 1973. Do you accept that it's still the most humane way to kill someone who's convicted?
It's not the most humane way to kill someone who's been convicted. It's one of the least humane ways to kill someone who's been convicted. We've found that. Part of the problem is that most of these inmates are under the effect of a paralytic drug and they can't move or show their pain. But of the 11 lethal injection executions in California, autopsy evidence shows that 6 of those executions, those men did not have sufficient sedative at the beginning, and that they were conscious and aware when the second 2 drugs were administered.
Deborah, how would you do it? How would you do it differently? What would be a more humane way?
A more humane way would be by firing squad, and I've written about that in some detail. Firing squad is quick. Brain death happens within a minute, and of the 3 modern executions that we've had in this country, those firing squad executions have gone off without a hitch.
Okay, John Lott, bring back the firing squad. What do you think?
Yeah, I have no problem with bringing back the firing squad, but you know, this issue that she was just bringing up with regard to it being humane, this has been litigated. She's lost. Her side has lost multiple times on this, and it's just an example of how, you know, she's not trying to pick kind of what's been decided by the courts as the standard of evidence. She's taking an advocacy position that one side brought up, and they've lost time after time the claim that she's making about the use of these particular drugs being inhumane. And it's just an example of, you know, how far she's willing to stretch.
Okay, so it's slightly ad hominem there, so I'm going to give you 20 seconds, Deborah, because I've got to wrap, but 20 seconds to respond to that, please.
Yeah, Mr. Lott's simply not familiar with the litigation that's existed in this area of lethal injection. I mean, courts have been have recognized widely that there are problems with these lethal injection drugs. We've had the lowest number of executions in 2016 that we've had since 1972 because of all the problems that this litigation has shown.
Okay, Deborah Denner and John Lott, unfortunately we are out of time.
And that's not ad hominem for her to...
Okay, oh.
Okay.
I'm out of time, John. Lula da Silva's legal team has their work cut out for them. The former president of Brazil faces multiple charges of corruption, including bribery and money laundering. The wide-ranging scandal threatens to take down Brazil's leftist leadership, which brought the country out of debt and made it a major player on the international stage. That success, though, might also be the key to keeping Lula out of jail and, believe it or not, catapult him back into the presidency. I'll discuss that point with one of da Silva's lawyers in just a moment, but first, here's Shoaib Hassan with this report.
He's always been a man of the people, and some now want him back. Calls are increasing for former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, popularly known as Lula, to return to public office. Former US President Barack Obama once called him the most popular politician on earth. But recent revelations present a major hurdle.
I don't know any politician in Brazil who managed any election without secret donations. Secret donations were 3/4 of funding, according to my judgment. No one in Brazil has been elected without secret donations.
Odebrecht's testimony is part of Operation Car Wash, an anti-bribery investigation that's rocked governments across South America. Lula is said to be among those named. He was taken into custody in January for questioning and has since been released. He says it happened only after he criticized the present government's handling of the scandal. Operation Car Wash began in 2014 when a money laundering inquiry against executives of Brazil's state-owned Petrobras oil company. The investigation revealed kickbacks worth at least $4 billion to politicians for awarding contracts. 16 companies, including Odebrecht, were implicated, and 93 people have been convicted and over 230 implicated. They include the top political leadership of Brazil, Panama and Peru. Lula's protege and recently ousted President Dilma Rousseff is also among those named, but so is her nemesis and current president, Michel Temer. He's said to have been present at a meeting where $4 million were handed over in exchange for favors.
Isso jamais aconteceu.
This never happened. Not in this meeting nor any other that I held during my public life, with any person or legal entity. I would never put my reputation at risk.
All this is taking place as Brazil goes through its worst recession in recent history. It's led to widespread protests against almost all politicians. The only exception is Lula. He led the country into the league of the world's fastest-growing economies during his 7-year term, lifting 20 million people out of poverty. And now it looks like he's back, and many believe he's the savior the country needs. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Sao Paulo is Valesca Martins. She's on Lula da Silva's legal team at Teixeira Martins and Advogados. Thanks so much for joining us, ma'am. When people read that former President Lula is a defendant in 5 separate corruption trials, they ask, is Lula corrupt? So is he?
No, he's not, and his innocence will be proven effectively in all procedures. Lula is a victim of lawfare with frivolous accusations, and as I've already proven in the first of the 5 procedures, when 73 witnesses were heard, 27 of which were accusation witnesses, and all of them cleared Lula. All of the documents already clear Lula of any wrongdoing. So his innocence will be proven, and we will fight all the end to prove it.
When it seems as if the courts might rule against 3 former presidents, that says democracy, doesn't it? It smacks of democracy. It says nobody is above the law. Even if you were the most powerful person in the country, the courts will still go after you if you were corrupt.
Well, if you are corrupt, yes, they should go after you. If you're not corrupt, they should not go after you. And this is Lula's case. Lula has always been the president that fought corruption in Brazil. He's the one that empowered the federal police. He's the one that gave independence to the federal prosecutor's office. Lula is the one who instituted the transparency portal. He was the one who gave independence to the agency specialized in fighting corruption. Therefore, Lula will prove that he's not above the law, but he's not beneath the law. He deserves the compliance of the law to its full extent. And if judged by an impartial judge, he will be found innocent.
When Marcelo Odebrecht, the former CEO of Odebrecht, which was found guilty of widespread bribery, claimed that the codename friend in the company's bribe list was referring to Lula, why do you think he said that? Was he lying?
I think after 2 years of being in prison, I think, yes, you will say anything to get out of prison. You will even follow a script by the federal prosecutor's office. He said he thought he was the friend. He doesn't prove it. He doesn't say he ever talked to him. He doesn't say anything that could implicate Lula in wrongdoing. He gives no evidence whatsoever of Lula's wrongdoing.
Do you think that the same people who are going after Lula da Silva are the ones who went after Dilma Rousseff and impeached her?
Yes, I believe they are actually very intertwined because it is, after all, what they stand for. It is the Brazil of the federal constitution of '88, the social state, an independent state, a state of pride, a state of economic growth, a state where oil is preserved, it is served to the people, it is applied investment for education, for healthcare. So I believe, yes, they are actually the ones going after Lula and filing the frivolous lawsuits. It's against a whole plan of what Lula stands for.
President Temer is also named in the corruption list, but he has temporary immunity because he's the president. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not aware of the allegations against President Temer. I have not read the files. As Lula's lawyer, what I'm concerned and I want to express is that Lula is innocent, and he has always made it very clear that he will prove his innocence in any courtroom, and he will go and testify before any judge and clarify any accusations brought against him.
If he's cleared, does he want to run for president again?
Well, he at this point, I think it's premature to say that he wants to run. Of course, the latest polls put him in first place, even to win in the first round of any election, first or second round of any election. If he always made it clear that if time comes and he needs to stand up for the project of Brazil, he believes in, he will run. But it's premature at this point.
It sounds as if that is a yes.
Well, if, again, as he says, if he believes that in 2018, the project of Brazil that he stands for, the project of Brazil that he fought for all of his 40 years of public life is in threat, yes, he said he will decide to run, yes.
Just for absolute clarity, I just want to ensure he hasn't ruled out running for president again.
No, he has not. He has not.
The Supreme Court,
he will come to run in 2018 if...
Please continue.
I'm sorry. If he feels that the project is threatened. Mm-hmm. Okay, no, please, you go ahead, please.
I want to ask you about the Supreme Court. Do you trust the Supreme Court?
Absolutely, we trust the Supreme Court. We have taken Lula's violations against his human rights to the UN before its Human Rights Committee, because our appeal system did not present itself to be effective against Lula's violations, or in terms of repairing it, or even stopping the violations from occurring. But we have absolutely certainty that once the Supreme Court analyzes the case in the future, it will see that Lula's violations occurred and Lula is found innocent.
Let me ask you about Sergio Moro, who was, of course, dubbed Super Moro by many who support him, the federal judge who initially was in charge of the car wash inquiry. Why do you believe he was impartial? What's your, or he was not impartial? What's your problem with him?
Well, we don't have a problem with him. We actually, it's very objective in terms of legal matters. He has shown to violate all of the codes of ethics of our magistrature. He has violated the codes of ethics of the Bangalore Code of Conduct from the UN. He has appeared in book launches where Lula is portrayed as being involved in a corruption scheme. He has been he let people photograph him with opponents, political opponents of Lula. And in order for you to be an impartial judge, you also have to give a perception of impartiality. Not only that, there's a legislative problem in Brazil. So the judge investigating and collecting the evidence, therefore involved in with the federal police, with the prosecutor's office in the investigation in Brazil, is the one who then is presiding the judge. But not only does he preside the trial, but he is actually the one alone to judge the merits of the case. Therefore, only this objective failure of legislation, which is inquisitorial, will lead to a lack of impartiality.
Ma'am, it's a pleasure talking to you, and it's been great getting some insight into what you think and, of course, what the former president, Lula da Silva, thinks. Thank you very much for joining us, Valeska Martins. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.